Okay, no time like the present. This is a video about ethical theory. I'm making this video though for the humanities class, for the HUMA 2 class, rather than for a philosophy class. This is meant to be a basic introduction to ethical theory, a little bit of philosophy to round out some of the other topics that we're looking at in our humanities class. I do want to say just one thing or two things very quickly in terms of approaching people who haven't been introduced to sort of academic study of philosophy before, because I've done that any number of times, and so there's some things that I'm used to. One thing, and so one of the things we're doing today is just figuring out what ethical theory is and what philosophers are doing when they talk about ethics. I mean, that's really the goal here. And there was an old British skit show called Monty Python. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. It's kind of an absurdist show. And I love this skit they had in Monty Python, where the soldiers were out there in the trenches in sort of World War I situation, and they had the killer joke. So they had all the soldiers put earplugs in so they couldn't hear it, and then they just played the killer joke out over through the speakers, and the enemy soldiers all heard the killer joke, and it was so funny that they all died laughing. And so that was the secret weapon that the army had. And sometimes I find when people sit down and they've been told that what they're going to be told about is ethics, they sort of think it's going to be like the killer joke, like maybe there's some slogan or some set of teachings, and if I teach them to you, then you'll become an ethical person. And that's kind of not really how it works. I mean, I can't, and we're going to talk about that more at some length. So the only other thing I'll say about that right now is that also reflects to some extent this notion of college or education as a kind of product or a kind of service that you're paid for, and which it is, and that's fine with me. I respect that. But then you come into the class and it's the ethics class, and so, well, okay, then tell me what's ethical. I mean, I paid my money, is tell me what's ethical. And of course, that's not how it works either. We're going to think, what is our real goal here? What is my goal with you always as a teacher? If you're one of my students, my goal with you is to work on skills and to improve skills, to carry on and do more things. And if you work with me, that's true. So that's what we're really doing here. But all right, so I am going to say more about that. The other thing I want to say about this, though, too, is another thing that people will think about ethics, or thinking about ethics in some sort of formal way, is that ethics aims at some kind of utopia. Like if I were to say that we should try and make everyone happy, then sometimes people will misinterpret that and think, well, that's crazy. You're saying everyone should just be happy, or you think you can make everyone happy? No, I don't think everyone should be happy all the time, and I don't think I can make everyone happy. And in any event, I'm not sure that being happy is the best thing. Anyway, we'll get to that. Right, but actually, no. The real reason is the opposite of some kind of utopian goal or something. I mean, the reason for ethical and spiritual religious traditions across time and space for human beings is that life is hard and life involves a lot of suffering. And so it is incumbent upon us to try to ameliorate that as best we can. And therefore, questions of value and questions of ethics are always going to be very important. Just say it one more time. The reason that it's important is because life is hard. So it's actually not something for the squeamish. I mean, there are people in medical ethics tell them it's utopian. Alrighty then. In any event, enough with the rah, rah, rah. Let's get to it. So, this is my take on ethical theory. First of all, ethical theory is part of philosophy, and philosophy for me is looking at concepts. Why do I keep saying that? Because I'm just this guy. I don't know about the fundamental nature of the universe or the teachings of the cosmos. I have to just do what I can with what I've got here as an ordinary person. And one thing that I can do is think about concepts and words and that kind of stuff. And that's, so I do blah, blah metaphysics, if it says, well, gee, doing metaphysics, that sounds pretty far out. But I think if you think of metaphysics in terms just of semantics, I mean, you can say, well, what I'm really interested in is the meanings of these words or what these words refer to. I'm trying to think about that, and that gets it a little bit more down to earth and a little bit less wild sounding about what you're doing. So first of all, I think that philosophers are interested in any problems that are, any topics that are metaphysically and epistemologically interesting. The example I always use is religion, not because I have any kind of axe to grind about religion, because it's an obvious example that you already know about already. You talk about God and angels, or what are these things? Do they exist? What do you mean by exist? Metaphysical. You say there's something that exists, but it's not a physical thing. How do you know about it? In some other way than I know about ordinary things. And so, for better or for worse, that's what makes religion a philosophical topic, because it's got these metaphysical and epistemologically interesting semantics to it when you're talking about angels and heaven and stuff, and faith. And that sort of is what delineates the philosophical topics, which ones are philosophically interesting. Value is a philosophically interesting area, and ethics is one part of this larger area of value. But anyway, slowing down maybe, the second bullet point on the slide there, I say ethical theory per se, as such, ethical theory itself, right? So I say, someone says, I don't like this verb to do that we have in the university. I do ethical theory. It seems, I don't know, I just don't like, I'll try and be more clunky and say, someone says, I'm going to study ethical theory, okay? I'm going to study ethical theory. What do you study? I study ethical theory, okay. That person isn't necessarily going to be prescribing any kind of moral code. And they're also not necessarily trying to construct some kind of moral code for themselves. They're not sort of trying to figure out necessarily what's the best ethics. And they're definitely not doing something, to the extent that they're doing philosophy, I don't think they're doing something where you could go to them and say, my Uncle Charlie asked me to do this, but and give you some sort of prescription. All right, although it is true that, say you thought that the right thing to do was to apply the golden rule and do unto others you would do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself, say. And in that might be a theory, right? It's a code anyway, and that you might use that to help you make a moral decision, and you might use that to pass judgment on an action of your own or someone else's. So some ethical theories are, ethical theories can be applied, but the philosopher who's thinking about ethical theory is thinking about ethical theory. I mean, as soon as you become a partisan, you're sort of not doing it anymore, It's asking the question. So ethical theory is studying the metaphysical epistemological issues in ethical language. We could do philosophy of language. We could ask about the property of meaning. There are lots of different ways that we can tease out philosophical issues. But it's philosophical issues that we're talking about. So value theory, again, ethics and aesthetics. We say things are good or bad in some sort of ethical sense. We say they're good or bad in an aesthetic sense. My own feeling is that ultimately those are kind of the same. And that, I think, reflects my own empiricist sympathies. We're going to talk about that more. So one way of looking at it is, again, think about the language. We say, well, that action was a good action. Now I can give you the physical description, the arm was moving, and I can describe everything, but then I say something else. In addition to all those physical properties that I just described the action as having or being, it also has, this property being good. And so the question there is a metaphysical question. Is there a non-physical property that's really a property? Or aren't physical properties really the only kinds of properties that there are? But if you get something that looks like a property and it's quacking like a property, it's definitely not a physical property. Well, then, maybe that's metaphysically interesting. That's how you figure it out. Similarly, how do you know what's right and wrong? Okay, you don't have guys in lab coats looking through microscopes someplace figuring out what's morally right and wrong. It's not how that knowledge is produced. So how is it produced? That's an epistemological question. So ethical evaluations and ethical thinking is metaphysically and epistemologically interesting. It is, that in short, philosophically interesting. When philosophers say that they're interested in ethics or studying ethics, that's what they're doing, the metaphysics and epistemology of value. Last bullet point then. Ethical theory is not necessarily an ethical activity. I mean, any activity is an ethical activity if it's done in an ethical way. I'm quite totalizing about that. I think that's true. And an ethical person is going to do ethical theory in an ethical way. An ethical person is also going to drive their car in an ethical way and interact with other people in an ethical way and do everything else that they do in an ethical way. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that they're doing ethical theory in an ethical way. But ethical theory, like driving your car, is something that you don't necessarily have to do in an ethical way, although it is harder to think of unethical activity doing studying ethical theory than driving your car. I don't know. But you get the point. And in particular, ethical theorists, ethical philosophers, I really don't see, and this is not being cute, and I'll qualify it a little if for the sake of common sense. But right off the bat, I'd say, look, someone who's interested in metaphysics and epistemology, and I've known quite a few. I mean, this person is not necessarily someone you would describe as a particularly well-formed or well-fulfilled ethical person. Quite often, yes. I mean, I certainly wouldn't describe professional philosophers as particularly bad people. I don't think they are. In fact, I think relative to other professional groups of people, the group of professional philosophers, thank you very much, I think is probably pretty enlightened and gentle and forward-looking, contrary to popular belief. I mean, again, compared to other professional groups. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. Ethics is, what I'm saying is that ethical theory is a particular philosophical topic. That is a metaphysical and epistemological topic, okay? And so that's why anyone who wants to sort of get a systematic handle on the subject of philosophy is going to get around to that. And as I'm going to show you now, the different ethical theories fall out from larger philosophical systems. Another thing I want to say is that academic ethical theory is canonical. I'm not actually saying this so much as a criticism, although pointing out and I'll explain what I mean by canonical right now here with the slide. But when I say that academic ethical theory is canonical, I don't mean that it's bad. I don't mean it's not worth your time. I think it is. I actually think it is worth your time. And I don't say that to invalidate it. It does suggest, to say that it's canonical, does suggest there might be other possibility spaces for thinking about ethics. And that I certainly do mean to suggest. But I don't say that in any kind of real undermining way. What I mean is, you can look at philosophy as part of, you have to look at philosophy as part of the overall culture. And one really important way to look at philosophy, I think, is as literature, as among other things, it is part of our literary heritage. So it's a body of literature. In the same way, if you go to the a language department, and they're going to have literature professors, and they're going to introduce you to the literature of that language, and that will be, of course, all the literary forms, novels and poems and so on. But there's also the rest of the literature of the language. And so there's a particular body of literature, a bunch of shelves of books and a bunch of topics. And philosophy sort of regards itself as a long conversation. There's a lot of truth in that. So more than a lot of other scholarly disciplines, philosophy pays a great deal of attention to its own history. You even meet philosophers who think that the history of philosophy is really all that philosophy is, which is sadly wrong, but you get the point. And then to be specific, it really is true. At one point, I was teaching contemporary philosophy in the history sequence. Contemporary philosophy is really mission impossible at this point, by the way, just as a footnote, because it's supposed to be everything from Kant until the present, and that's impossible. And philosophy is even has schisms and things since then that, you know, it's impossible to do that. But anyway, I was thinking about it. I realized I'd long sort of thought, you know, when people are teaching early modern and they make this distinction between the rationalists and the empiricists, you know, that's a cheap heuristic. That's an easy way to slice it up. They're all talking about the same stuff. The farther away we get from that century, the more it's clear that they are talking about the same stuff, of course. But actually, settling in for the semester, doing the contemporary and asking the question as the theme of the course, you know, what about this rationalist empiricist? But I actually convinced myself that no, it really does extend all the way through the 19th and 20th centuries, and the sort of splits that we see between what people call continental and analytic. I don't care about other parts and stuff myself. But I do think actually there's a substantial branching that is consistent. I do think that. And at one point I thought, well, that's too pat to be true, but actually I think it sort of is. And so when I say that ethical theory is canonical, you've got the ethical theory that's generated by rationalism and the ethical theory that's generated by empiricism, just like you've got the psychology that's generated by rationalism, the psychology that's generated by empiricism, you know, and everything else, political theory, metaphysics, what you will, or the lack thereof. So I'm going to cover them. I'm going to give you this, you know, potted intros to the three basic branches of ethical theory. And so if you were to go to the college and you hadn't taken an ethics class before, you know, that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking about the person who goes in and says, why are these people doing this and talking about what they're doing and reading the books that they're reading? And this is why. It's an old area of literature. And I don't point it out, that last bullet point there, to criticize it, only to be clear about what that means. And also, yeah, particularly that it's very vascular with the main line of philosophy in general, of metaphysics and epistemology in general, and early modern philosophy in general. So it's part of that whole conversation too. Sometimes I think people think that the ethics class is going to be, I don't know what, some sort of nice part of the intellectual world where everything's ethical and good. I don't know. And they're somewhat dismayed to find that, no, it's kind of a nuts and boltsy philosophy class, because philosophy gets kind of nuts and boltsy. All right, so rationalist ethics, and as you might assume, I mean, the basic notion of rationalist ethics is that it's your capacity for reason, your being a rationalist being, that makes ethics possible. And another characteristic of rationalist ethics, shared with Plato, who we can think of as a rationalist, he's not exactly like Kant, is this idea that trying to be maximally rational is the same thing as trying to be ethical. So now we're going to do Kant. All rational beings are capable of universalizing, says Kant. What does that mean? That is, of thinking of myself as a generic rational being. Now, this is just common teaching, by the way. Again, what is the ethicist trying to do? First of all, the ethical philosopher, in the first place, is trying to figure out how ethical thinking goes in reality, not trying to come up with some sort of slogan about how everyone should do this, like some crazy character in Jonathan Swift, but rather think more in terms of a sort of social psychologist asking themselves, how is it that people make rational decisions? How does it go? Like the man said, in some sense, philosophy changes nothing, right? So the way Kant has it is this: you're a rational being. Plato thought that, you know, to the extent that you were determined by your physical body, you could overcome that determination by using your transcendental capacity to think logically. And in that sense, Plato agrees with Kant. There are important metaphysical differences between them, but let's leave that aside. So for Kant, you experience it as a duty. Why? Well, because you are a rational being. And so since you're a rational being, you see that you could put yourself in the place of any rational being when you were making an ethical decision. And seeing that that was possible in being a rational being, then among other things, you would also see that things would work out for the best if you and everyone else put themselves in the universalizing position when they were making ethical judgments, making ethical decisions about what to do. And so if that's the sense, actually a logical imperative. Why logical? Because if you really are a logical being, Kant says, then you're going to see that everyone putting themselves in the universalizing position would be for the best. So notice kind of a logical reason that transcends sort of a moral reason, or is the same thing as a moral reason. Remember, rationalist ethics, cognitivist. This is important. Cognitivist ethical theories are any ethical theories that hold ethical thinking to be a kind of logical thinking. Among other reasons that that's important is that sometimes this canonical philosophy that we're talking about today, this literature, is accused of being entirely cognitivist about ethics, of saying that this is a kind of masculinist literature that only values rationalism and that sort of thing. And as I've said a number of times, I'm an empiricist, and the empiricist tradition I'm getting to next just doesn't do that. So that's important if you want to make critiques of ethical theory. Among other things, it's just not the case that ethical theory is entirely cognitivist. Rationalist ethics is cognitivist. A good thing about Kant, this kingdom of ends, I find teaching Kant's ethics to be, I'm not sure that I agree with everything that Kant says. And in my work on philosophy of mind, Kant's sort of my bad guy in a little bit, or, in that sense. So I'll get around. So when I'm teaching Kant's ethics, I'm always thinking, well, I don't really agree with this. I think this empiricist ethics is better. But then what always happens is when I get the papers in from the students all always think that Kant is the best. I mean, try as I might to convince them otherwise. And it is an intuitively very appealing kind of view. So this is thinking about that last bullet point about the kingdom of ends. That a rational being has their own ends. That is, they have their own intentions, their own system of beliefs and desires and so on. They can be described intentionally in terms of their beliefs and desires and hopes and fears. Excuse me. All of which have logical relationships with each other. They're rational beings. And that is why they come under the intentional description. So that means that they have their own ends. That is, they are autonomous, self-interested, rational beings pursuing their own ends. And so that, to Kant, is what invests the rational being with the status of being a legitimate recipient of moral concern. That they have their own ends, and therefore they are never merely to be used as a means to an end. Okay? You can never use a rational being that is an end in itself as a means to your end. And this is the Enlightenment Kant. Remember, this is the time of Thomas Paine and common sense and the age of reason. And Kant is part of all that. Kant is saying here that, we've had the Reformation, we've had the rise of the nations. We have religious and national divisions now. But we can, through the recognition that we are all rational beings, Plato thinks the same thing, through the recognition that we are all rational beings, in that sense we are equal, and in that sense it's clear how to treat each other equally, which is through universalizing, which is transcendental, transcending, that is, the specific contingencies of each individual person, in as much as they're a contingent physical person. It's a transcendental ethics. It's only in as much as you're rational, right, that you're in this. Kant's not very good on the question of animals. People who are very good on the question of animals are the empiricist ethicists. That is David Hume and John Stuart Mill. The level in which I approach these things, I tend to think about David Hume more, but it's certainly true that in terms of ethical theory, the more important person to understand is John Stuart Mill. Why Hume? Because Hume develops what I've been talking about here, this non-cognitivist ethics, which I think is kind of important. Hume says, reason is the slave of the passions. So you have your contingent desires that are sort of presented to you by virtue of the kind of body and style of life and so on that you're living. I mean, on this sort of animal level. And then reason is what you use to try and get the, remember Hobbes said, freedom is the ability to move towards the objects of your desire, leaving the question of what those were, the pursuit of happiness, right? This is the liberal view. Okay, so humans have innate precognitive moral sentiments. A thing about Hume that impresses me is this. Hume says we are endowed with these sentiments of beneficence and care towards our fellow human beings, for example. And Hume says, Mother Nature has endowed us with these sentiments. I know not why, but perhaps some natural scientist in the future will tell us the reason for this. And he stipulates, I mean, I'm not saying he says natural scientist, but he stipulates he thinks it's going to be a scientific or naturalistic explanation when one comes. So to me, I mean, the brilliance of Hume there is that, you know, writing 100 years before Darwin, is that Hume sees what he's missing. He understands that he doesn't have the part that explains where the moral sentiments come from, the non-rational, pre-rational moral sentiments. He gets it, but he also gets it that there ought to be an explanation for that. And indeed, it's only 100 years, right? It only takes 100 years for someone else, Charles Darwin, to give the theoretical framework that will explain that. That is, we have altruism and these moral sentiments because we are social creatures, and group selection is a level of selection. Sometimes in biological theory, people will argue that there are different levels of that which level of selection is the level of selection. That's how Dawkins got all that gene stuff going, but actually all the levels are levels, any place where anything's happening. Anyway, and look for the empiricist, this is the third bullet point, ethics and aesthetics very closely linked. According to the Kantian, you know, it really doesn't matter how it feels to you at all. And this is sort of a very heroic rationalist view of ethical behavior. It's certainly true that sometimes we think that some things are more important than suffering and death, and it's important to unpack that. And I think someone like Jeremy Bentham, who's a predecessor of John Stuart Mill, who just wanted to have hedons, he just wanted to measure units of pleasure and sort of get the calculus going. And that's not going to work. And Mill understood that you have sort of higher pleasures and lower pleasures, and that needed to be elaborated. But the way in which the empiricist is different from the rationalist, essentially on this, I think, is that value ultimately lies in the quality of experience. Ultimately, it's the quality of experience that is the aim of life, the quality of one's own experience and the quality of the experience of beings to whom one is being good, one is being altruistic. And the crucial thing to see about John Stuart Mill, like Charles Darwin, not coincidentally, exactly for the same reasons, is that this is a bottom-up trial and error model of ethics. People overlook that about John Stuart Mill, by the way. People tend to read this. Let me step out of this even, just because I think it's an important idea about Mill. Mill, the utilitarianism is always read in this prescriptive kind of way, and it's always figuring out, well, you know, what are the problem with scope, and is it average versus aggregate, and how are we going to sort of instantiate utilitarianism? But I think there's a side of Mill that gets missed there, and maybe it's just contingent on this traditional way he's handled. but Mill is definitely an empiricist, and if it's true that that I aim for actions which produce the most good as concrete outcomes of the actions, real outcomes of the actions, that necessarily is going to be a trial and error kind of ethics, a bottom up kind of ethics, an ethics that develops itself based on figuring out what are those things which are going, in fact, to maximize happiness and maximize utility. So it's an observation of, it's an empiricist observation of the way that ethical thinking goes. It's not just a prescription that Mill has sort of cooked up and pressed upon us. He is observing human ethical behavior, and he's saying what people are always doing is aiming at the good outcome. And that's where evolution is, the moral evolution is taking place. So I think that aspect of Mill as the classic philosopher who's telling us how it goes gets eclipsed with this attitude towards Mill that he is got this huge sort of prescriptive program all the time, which he does. I mean, that's okay. Anyway, just to finish up with that, then the last bullet point on that slide. So hedonism, in ethical theory, hedonism doesn't mean, being a sort of rakish playboy or something like that. Hedonism is a technical term. It just means what I've been talking about, that you have these sort of worldly states of pain and pleasure. They're contingent on the nature of your body and the situation. And ethics is really situational and based in that. I think that's what really distinguishes consequentialism from other kinds of ethics. The rationalists want to be transcendental, Plato, in the same as the rest of them, on the theory that the physical passions and determinations of the body are only going to be either amoral or leading to trouble, or maybe even that morality is in fact a discipline of overcoming the physical that way. And the empiricists just don't see things that way. In fact, I think for Mill, that when the first, you have a universe that's full of rocks and gas, and then at some point or the other, somewhere you start to get beings that are having experiences that are good or bad for them. And deliberately vague, right? Let's be deliberately vague. There are beings that are having good experiences that are good or bad for them. So then I think on Mill's view, this is the way I read Mill anyway, at that moment when those beings came into being, that's when value came into that universe. That's when ethics came into that universe. The rationalists would say there was a sort of transcendental structure holding up ethical potentialities in a universe where it doesn't have any matter and energy in it at all, Okay, so I think we have 2 more. Yeah. The third school, which has gotten bigger and bigger, it was the third cousin, but it's a pretty big deal, is virtue ethics or virtue theory, which is a revival of the classics, and particularly of Aristotle. As Nicomachean Ethics is mostly what people appeal to, which is a great book, by the way, and you should really read it. It's full of all kinds of cool metaphysical ideas, as he always is. Now, so Aristotle is teleological. What does this mean? Aristotle, if he were alive today, would probably be a biologist in a biology department, I think. He's really interested in organisms. He takes organisms to be fundamental beings, sort of, and he's also interested in artifacts, human artifacts. Because Aristotle is thinking that there's a sense in which there's a causal pull from the future. This is what's meant by teleology, the logos of the telos, la meta in Espanol, the aim, the goal. So think of it this way. I'm looking at a organ of a human being, and I'm giving a physical description of this organ, and I say it's red, and it's got 4 chambers, and it's made out of muscle. I can say everything I want about it along those lines, but I don't know what it is until I say it's a pump, until I say it's a heart. It's pumping the blood. That's its function. Okay, that's its telos. So Aristotle sort of looks at the whole organism and he's interested in the parts of the, you see, the organ only makes sense in the context of the whole organism and not the other way around. If you were a reductive materialist, you'd think that the organism was just made out of all the organs. But it's the opposite. You can only explain the individual organ in terms of the function it has in the whole organism. So Aristotle thinks materialism is really, really wrong, by the way. If you know enough about philosophy to know that you think reductive materialism is bad, 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 but you're not quite clear who's who, guess what? Plato and Aristotle also think that reductive materialism is bad, bad, bad. So I'm not taking sides on that. I'm only, if you're into that, then you should respect Plato and Aristotle because they have really good arguments against reductive materialism. And I just gave you one that that it looks as if functional descriptions are teleological in as much as they appeal to the function that this thing plays in some larger system. So now here's a funny thing about virtue ethics. So virtue ethics is going to amount to a kind of talking about and then cultivating. So like all Greek philosophy, it's what we call soteriological. That is, it aims at personal transformation. It's a discipline. Aristotle is teaching a discipline of moderation, among other things. It's interesting. You should look at it. In any event, so rationalists are looking at the intentions, right? They want to know what someone was trying to do. Empiricists take actions. And by the way, John Stuart Mill has another really excellent book called On Liberty, where he's talking about sort of not trying to look into people's minds and read their minds and having that be a private space and having action be the public space. So he has an interesting argument sort of against the rationalists in that book On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. The thing about the Greeks is the Greeks are judging the person. The same way see, the thing for Aristotle is Aristotle doesn't think, oh, well, you know, there's a good sports car and there's a good knife, there's a good horse, okay, and that's a good person. And we might think, well, there's two senses in which there's a good person. I mean, that might be a good physical specimen of a person, but that doesn't mean that they're ethically a good person. And the philosopher Nietzsche, who I mentioned that last bullet point on the slide there, was attracted to the Greeks this way because Aristotle doesn't seem to really make that distinction. He loves to taxonomize things, and he does talk about different kinds of valuable properties. But you know, a good knife, a good person, a good sports car, a good horse, a good peach tree, a good citizen, you know, and he didn't really make that distinction between some of those are just qualitative properties and some of those are somehow ethical properties. And as I say, Nietzsche thought this was the great warrior ethos. Okay. So just following through, I said I was going to do a little conceptual analysis. I know, I imagine some hardcore ethical theorists might find this kind of obnoxious. There are real metaphysical and epistemological contradictions between, for example, rationalism and empiricism that can't really be brushed over. But I do want to suggest that ethics is a heterogeneous concept, as I think that the concept of mind is a heterogeneous concept. That is, it's a concept that actually refers to a number of different things and has a number, therefore, of different uses or applications. In a sense, you can find three different words in the one word, I think. I think in mind, you can find two different words in the one word. We have two different vocabularies, the intentional vocabulary and the phenomenal vocabulary. I don't think I think they're different. So, so we have the assumption that concepts are homogeneous just because they're words, they're abstract nouns. So the grammar of that leads us to think that well has one meaning, even though lots of concept words aren't homogeneous at all. And then we also have a reflex to set up doctrinal disputes, makes it so you can write articles and stuff. And so this leads to the strong impression you have these camps in an existential struggle, right? Like either the one has to be right or the other. And then another reason for it is for this idea that there's an existential struggle is because we also don't get that mind, for example, is a heterogeneous concept. And I'm going to show you the relationship between those two not gettings in a second. Well, right now, in fact, the last bullet point on the slide. So look, human beings are members of three different overlapping sets, but they're not sets that are identical. There's the set of all rational beings. Not all human beings are actually practically rational. They're potentially maybe, but in any event, most human beings that you're dealing with are rational beings. And then there are conscious beings. I'm pretty sure that in order to be a rational, well, I don't know. I mean, no, I don't think you have to be conscious to be rational, because I think there could be an artifact that has some rational properties, not conscious. I wonder if you have to be rational to be conscious. I also sort of think no. Mill would say sentient for conscious, meaning just having feelings, getting stuff in through the five sensory modalities. I'm talking about consciousness in terms of having phenomenal experiences. I think those are pretty closely related. And then there's also, someone as a biological being. I'm talking about someone's, maybe if you're talking about someone's drinking, you're really approaching them on a biological level, or maybe you should be. So three different senses of ethics mapping onto three different kinds of beings. You could definitely have rational beings that were not biological beings, and you can definitely have biological beings that aren't rational beings. If you think like and are not conscious, maybe they're not, then you can have biological beings that aren't conscious beings. And I think you can have rational beings that aren't conscious beings too. At least it's potentially possible. So you see how that goes. So I would actually want to say that what we need to understand is that we have three different things that we are calling ethics, depending on the way in which we're approaching a human. And in fact, if we were dealing with other rational beings, and we are dealing with other conscious beings, and we are dealing with other biological beings, then we get in the same kinds of situations. Because those are these are the ethics for sets of kinds of beings. Last thing I'll say, that's just, me. Last thing I'll say is this is very unpopular, so it's buried here at the end of this little instructional video that maybe very few people will ever see. Because philosophy departments are often sort of fighting all these kind of turf wars, trying to say, well, if you want to teach ethics of anything, computer ethics or business ethics or engineering ethics or nursing ethics, you have to have philosophers. They have to be, sometimes the philosophers really try to hold you up and say, no, it has to be a philosophy course. It has to have the code of a philosophy course. I've seen that. I'm against all that. I think that that what I'm saying right here follows from what I was saying at the beginning, right? Which was that philosophers study philosophy, metaphysics, and epistemology. They study value because value is metaphysically and epistemologically interesting. So I have a pretty strong position on this then. I think it's actually just a flat out equivocation to confuse philosophers who study ethical theory with people who can teach people how to do things ethically, or even how to teach people in some field how to do things ethically, how to teach how to do things ethically. I don't think so. Lots of philosophers will sort of concede and make a wishy-washy, well, I think it helps a little. Nah, it's a straight out equivocation. And not only that, but then the nursing school and the Aggie school and the business school aren't developing their own ethics. And who should be doing that? Well, you find the old timer who's got a good distinguished record of excellence in the work, but who also has a good distinguished reputation amongst their peers for doing good things. What are good things? Well, ask someone who runs farms. Ask someone who's a nurse. How should I know? Those things should be. We should just have a culture where we expect every department to have an ethicist and to be developing their ethics. But that means philosophy needs to get out of the way. Philosophers study metaphysics and epistemology. As I say, some philosophers, believe it or not, get spitting mad when I say all this. Because I'm the skunk at the garden party. I don't think, on my campus, they were talking about getting rid of the philosophy major and all the other philosophers were going to jump off the roof. Oh, I mean, okay, I'm a humanities teacher, fine. I'll still teach philosophy. I just don't think it's very philosophical to be sort of getting in a fight with the engineering school because you think you'll get more funding that way. My gosh, I don't do stuff like that. The engineering school can do whatever they want. Anyway, I just put that there. If that doesn't make any sense to you, really don't worry at all about it, because that's probably the very last you'll ever hear of it. Anyway, so there's a little introduction to ethical theory, part of humanities, and I shall see you next week.